When my family decided to move to Salem, Massachusetts, we were looking for a fresh start, a new chapter in our lives. The house we found seemed straight out of a fairy tale, with its Victorian style and a large garden that seemed to promise peace and tranquility. It was the kind of place you see and immediately imagine building a happy life in, with children running on the lawn and cozy nights around the fireplace. But reality began to show its true colors within the first few nights. The tranquility that the place seemed to offer was superficial. There was something else there, a persistent feeling that we were being watched. At first, I tried to disregard this feeling, attributing it to the stress of moving and the novelty of the environment. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, influenced by the tales and legends of historic Salem. The house had its natural noises, of course, like any old building. But there were certain sounds that could not be easily explained. On one particularly silent night, the sound of a door slamming shut yanked me out of sleep. I got up, heart racing, and walked through the house in search of a logical explanation. Maybe an open window, I thought, that a gust of wind might have closed. But no, all doors and windows were firmly shut, and there was no wind outside. That was the first time the feeling of being watched turned into the certainty that something was wrong. The days that followed only increased our unease. Strange things continued to happen, lights flickering without explanation, almost imperceptible whispers in the hallways, like whispered conversations in an unknown language. One morning, my daughter, Emily, who is very sensitive, came to me with a worried look. "Daddy," she said in her trembling little voice, "who is the lady that stays in my room at night? She keeps saying things I don't understand." The blood froze in my veins. There was no woman in our house, at least none that we could see. That was when I decided we needed to thoroughly investigate the history of the house. I needed answers, not just to calm my family, but to protect Emily from something I still didn't understand. What we discovered in the following days would lead us to question not only our decision to move to that house, but also our ability to discern reality from what seemed to be a continuous nightmare. Our search for answers was just beginning, and I already felt that some truths, once revealed, would never let us live in peace again. The house had secrets that whispered through the hallways at night, that made the doors slam, and that were now beginning to reveal themselves, slowly, each more disturbing than the last. It was a journey that none of us were truly prepared to face, but that had already begun, whether we wanted it or not. After a week in that house, the oddities that seemed like mere coincidences began to manifest as a disturbing routine. Each day brought us closer to something we couldn't understand, something that hid in the shadows and silent corners of our new home. On one particularly quiet night, when the silence felt more like a warning than a comfort, the commotion began with a startling noise of something being dragged in the attic. My wife and I exchanged worried glances. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no wind, nor any animals that could justify such a noise. With my heart pounding, I decided to investigate, despite Lisa's insistence that we should just leave it alone. I climbed the stairs, which creaked under each step, feeling the air grow colder as I approached the attic. The door, which I remembered firmly closing earlier, was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my heart beating so loudly it seemed to echo through the dusty space before me. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the old smell of wood and mold. That was when I saw, at the far end of the attic, an old wooden box moving slightly as if something inside it was trying to get out. I returned downstairs, trying not to show the fear that consumed me. "It must be just some animal trapped," I tried to reassure Lisa, though my voice betrayed my true concern. That night, we hardly slept, alert to any sound, any sign of movement. In the following days, the whispers became more frequent and clear. One early morning, I woke up to a female voice whispering my name at the foot of the bed. The room was immersed in darkness, and the only light was from the moon timidly filtering through the curtains. I sat up in bed, heart racing, searching the gloom for the source of the voice. But there was no one. Lisa, beside me, slept deeply, oblivious to the sound that terrified me. Fear began to consume us, making every shadow seem to hide a dark secret, every corner of the house an invisible gaze. I knew something was wrong, something old and disturbing that refused to be ignored. The decision to uncover the house's past became not just a matter of curiosity but an urgent necessity. We needed to understand what was happening before we lost our sanity, or something worse. Weeks passed, and despite our efforts to ignore the signs that something was terribly wrong, the events in the house only intensified. Each night, the feeling of being watched became more oppressive, as if we were being monitored by unblinking, invisible eyes. On one particularly cold and silent early morning, I was awakened by a whisper. It was low, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to rouse me from sleep. I looked around. The room was dark, with only the pale moonlight entering through the windows. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the whisper grew clearer, as if someone was right beside me, murmuring my name. I got up slowly, my breathing quickening. The sound came from the hallway, and I could swear the voice sounded desperate, as if trying to warn me of something. With a chill running down my spine, I walked toward the sound, trying to stay calm. The house was so silent that the sound of my footsteps seemed deafening. When I reached the hallway, the feeling of panic intensified. The shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, creating shapes that danced and contorted in the faint moonlight. As I approached the end of the hallway, I saw something that made me freeze, a shadow cast against the wall, but it wasn't a normal shadow. It was an indistinct figure, a presence that seemed to pulsate with a cold, malevolent energy. I tried to turn on the lights, but nothing happened. The house seemed to be plunged into a darkness that was not just physical, but supernatural as well. Then the figure started to move, slowly gliding towards me. I felt an icy presence, like a cold breeze passing through me, even though there was no wind. My heart was racing, and I tried to back away, but my legs were paralyzed, as if something was holding me in place. The dark figure seemed to have a human shape, but with eyes that glowed with a cold, cruel light. With immense effort, I managed to return to the bedroom, trying not to look back. Lisa, who had woken up from the noise, was scared. "What was that?" she asked, her eyes searching for answers I didn't have. I could only hold her, feeling the terror of knowing that something was watching us, something unnatural. The next morning, the feeling of terror didn't diminish. On the contrary, it felt like the house was charged with a palpable tension, an imminent threat hanging over us. The sense that something was about to happen was almost unbearable, as if we were on the verge of uncovering a horrendous truth that, once revealed, would never allow us to return to normalcy. And I knew that to understand what was really happening, we would need to face the horrors the house was hiding. Horrors that seemed to be just beginning to reveal themselves. After all the terrifying experiences, we began to realize that we needed to understand the house's past if we were to have any chance of finding answers and, perhaps, peace. So, we decided to investigate the history of the house, though I didn't expect this to bring good news. I went to the local library and talked to some of Salem's oldest residents. They had a sad look, almost as if they had been expecting this. I was guided to the local history archive and began to explore old records. Soon, I started finding disturbing information about the house. I discovered that the house had belonged to a man named Nathaniel Graves in the late 19th century. Graves was not a name anyone would hear and think of something benign. He was known for his occult practices and macabre rituals. The archive showed that Graves had been an occultist interested in invoking entities and spirits from beyond the grave. Nathaniel Graves' name itself seemed to carry an aura of evil and despair. The most disturbing discovery was that he had been accused of performing human sacrifice rituals in the house. There were records of missing people who, according to rumors, had been sacrificed to appease or invoke evil spirits. The pages I flipped through were covered with notes and accounts of people who had seen dark figures and experienced paranormal phenomena. The words and stories I read were like a cold shower. The idea that something so terrible and malevolent had happened in our house was terrifying. The descriptions of the rituals and the entities' graves had invoked were almost surreal. The text spoke of entities that fed on fear and pain, beings that were summoned to fulfill horrific pacts. Leaving the library, the feeling that something was waiting for me at home grew stronger. The house's history seemed not only to explain what we were experiencing, but to intensify the fear. If the spirits' graves had invoked were still present, they weren't just there to haunt. They were there for a reason, and whatever it was, it seemed to be getting closer to confronting us. I returned home with the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. The sense that the house was alive with an ancient and malevolent presence had never been so palpable. We knew that to fully understand what was happening, we needed to dig deeper. It was no longer just about dealing with apparitions and sounds. Now it was about facing a dark past that seemed to have resurfaced with a vengeance. The house was laden with a history of horror, and we were the latest to face the consequences of a past that should never have been uncovered. After discovering the house's dark past, the feeling of dread became unbearable. We knew that to understand what was truly happening, we needed to confront what Graves had left behind. The idea that the spirits of his victims might still be wandering the house was something we couldn't ignore. That night, as we tried to sleep, the atmosphere in the house felt different. It was as if an invisible weight was pressing down on us, making every movement, every sound, even more distressing. Emily was particularly restless, and her fear was almost palpable. Even when we calmed her, she couldn't stop talking about the lady who appeared in her nightmares, a pale and sad figure, as if trapped between the world of the living and the dead. That's when we decided to take a more direct approach. We decided to conduct a small investigation on our own. We took some flashlights, a camera, and a voice recorder, trying to capture anything that might give us more clues. Our intention was simple: document what was happening and perhaps find some evidence that would help us understand what was haunting us. As the night wore on, we began to explore the house with a mix of curiosity and fear. What had once been just a feeling of unease now seemed to materialize into concrete forms. We walked through the dark hallway, the sounds of our flashlights echoing off the empty walls. The feeling of being watched was constant, as if something was following us with every step. On the second floor, the atmosphere felt particularly heavy. We decided to start with the living room, where the apparitions had been most frequent. As we started recording, everything seemed calm until the recorder picked up a low, indecipherable whisper. The sound was almost like a distant moan, which we couldn't immediately identify. Moving to Emily's room, the temperature seemed to drop drastically. The camera began to malfunction, the images shaking and the colors distorting, as if something was interfering with the equipment. I had a chilling sensation down my spine. The recorder captured something that made my blood run cold, a voice clearly whispering Emily's name. Suddenly, our flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. Panic set in, and when we turned the flashlights back on, we found a horrendous sight. Emily's bedroom door was open, and a dark shadow seemed to crawl across the floor, disappearing as soon as we entered. The feeling that something was about to attack us was overwhelming, and the house seemed alive with a threatening energy. We tried to stay calm and went back to the living room. Then the recorder captured another sound, a muffled scream that seemed to come from inside the walls. The air was dense, almost too heavy to breathe, and the fear was palpable. It felt as if we were being tested, as if the spirits wanted us to discover something horrible. We turned off the equipment and tried to calm ourselves. The night ended without any more visible incidents, but the feeling that something was about to happen did not go away. The presence in the house was becoming clearer and more unsettling, as if it was preparing to reveal its true purpose. Whatever it was becoming bolder, and it seemed that our next step would be to confront directly what was haunting us, a task that terrified us more than anything we had faced before. After that night of investigation, our situation seemed to escalate into something more disturbing. We were trapped in a waking nightmare, and the feeling that something was about to reveal itself grew more intense each day. The house, which was once just a strange place, now seemed to be attacking us from within. We decided it was time to confront the problem directly. Based on the information we had discovered about Nathaniel Graves' rituals, the idea was to try to understand if there was some sort of object or symbol that might be keeping the entities trapped or feeding their presence. We went to the library again, trying to find more information about the rituals Graves had performed. As we researched, something strange began to happen. In one of the old books we found, the words started to move and change, as if they were being rewritten in real time. The letters rearranged themselves, forming messages that seemed intended to haunt us. One of them said, "You cannot escape." Another was more personal, "Emily will be mine." We returned home with a growing sense of despair. That night, the tension in the air was more palpable than ever. Emily had started having nightmares again, and her fear was consuming us. We decided to try a simple ritual, an attempt to appease the spirits or at least better understand what was happening. We prepared the living room with candles, symbols, and a recording of the rituals Graves had practiced. The idea was to perform a controlled invocation, something that might allow us to communicate directly with the entities present. The atmosphere was charged with an oppressive fear, and the shadows seemed denser, more threatening. We began the ritual, following the steps we had learned. With each word we spoke, we felt a change in the environment. The temperature dropped drastically, and a cold wind began to blow through the house, even with all the windows closed. The candles flickered, and the symbols started to glow with a sinister light. Then we heard a sound coming from the attic, a noise that seemed like a rhythmic pounding, as if something was trying to escape from there. The sound grew louder, becoming more intense and frantic. The fear we felt was so great it seemed to root us to the floor, as if the house was trying to prevent us from discovering something that should not be revealed. As the ritual reached its climax, the air became oppressive and dense. It felt as if an invisible force was trying to push us away. The candles went out all at once, plunging the room into total darkness. The shadows on the walls seemed to come to life, twisting and stretching as if preparing to attack us. And then, the voice. A cold, distant male voice began to speak, whispering words we couldn't fully understand. It was a voice that seemed to come from a place far beyond human comprehension. It carried centuries of pain and anger, and what was said was clear enough to know we were dealing with something beyond our control. In the middle of the darkness, a figure appeared in the doorway of the room. It was an indistinct shadow, with a form reminiscent of the entities Graves had described invoking. The presence seemed to be slowly approaching, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. Lisa grabbed my hand with such force it felt like her fingers would break. We tried to light the candles again, but everything was in disarray, and the figure seemed to be getting closer. With superhuman effort, we finally managed to light a candle, and the light revealed something even more disturbing. The figure was slowly disappearing, as if merging with the darkness of the house. But the worst part was the feeling that, although the figure was fading, the evil presence had only intensified. The house was filled with a terrible energy, and the sense that we were on the brink of something even more horrific had never been clearer. The night ended in absolute terror, with all of us feeling that the house was preparing for something big, something that would go beyond our worst nightmares. The sense that something terrible was about to happen was almost unbearable, and we knew that our next step would be to face whatever was waiting for us, one way or another. The following night was the most horrendous of all. The feeling that something big was about to happen became almost unbearable. It was as if the house itself was breathing, and the air was thick with palpable fear. In our minds, we knew we had no choice but to face whatever was haunting us. Based on the evidence we had gathered, we decided that the best course of action was to confront the entities directly. We were preparing for a showdown with whatever was waiting for us. Deep down, we knew this might be our last chance to find some form of peace or at least understand what was really happening. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house was suffocatingly tense. We placed the camera and voice recorder in several strategic points around the house and began our approach. The feeling of being watched was now so intense it felt almost physical. The shadows seemed to move, writhing grotesquely as if they were preparing for something. We started the confrontation in the attic, where the sound had been most intense the previous night. The stairs creaked under our feet, and each step seemed to echo menacingly. When we reached the top, the atmosphere was frigid. The flashlight revealed a room in disarray, with old objects scattered everywhere. It was as if something had passed through, dragging everything in its path. We placed the camera and recorder in the center of the attic and began reciting words of protection we had found in the old records. The idea was to create a barrier, something that could protect us from any force that might try to attack. But as we spoke, the environment seemed to react. The shadows on the wall began to stretch and contort as if preparing for something horrible. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically. Everyone's breath became visible, and a cold wind started to blow, even though all the windows were closed. The candles we had lit went out all at once, plunging the attic into total darkness. Then we heard a noise, a deep, agonizing moan, as if someone was trying to free themselves from unbearable pain. With the flashlight trembling in my hands, I tried to illuminate the room, and what I saw was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. A nebulous figure appeared in the corner of the attic. It was a dark shadow, with indistinct contours and a menacing presence. It seemed to be trying to materialize, and the air was thick with a heavy, hostile energy. The figure began to approach us, and the sense of fear was so intense it felt crushing. Lisa and Emily were beside me, paralyzed with terror. The sound of the moan grew louder, more piercing, and it seemed to be coming directly from the figure. It was as if the entity was trying to communicate or perhaps scare us even more. We tried to continue the ritual, reciting words of protection and calling for any benevolent force that might help us. But the presence in the attic seemed to be getting stronger, feeding off the fear we were emanating. The shadows began to move frantically, and the figure in the corner seemed to be trying to fully manifest, writhing and extending its limbs in a grotesque manner. Then, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house, interrupting what seemed to be a moment of absolute terror. The attic door had slammed shut, and the entire house seemed to shake. An invisible force seemed to be pushing us out of the attic. The feeling that something was about to break through the barrier of the physical world was palpable. Desperate, we tried to leave the attic, but the environment was against us. Each step felt like a challenge, as if the house was trying to trap us. Finally, we managed to get down the stairs, our hearts racing uncontrollably, and the feeling that whatever was in the house was now in a state of agitation and anger, something we had never experienced before. When we finally left the house, the sense of relief was accompanied by deep fear. The house seemed to fall silent, as if it were waiting, planning its next move. We knew that whatever was there had not been fully confronted, and the idea that it might be lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again, was a terrifying prospect. What we had experienced was a glimpse of something much larger, something beyond our comprehension. The house, with its dark past and malevolent entities, seemed far from letting us go. And so, with our hearts still racing and our fear on edge, we knew that our confrontation with the unknown was far from over. After that terrible night, the house seemed forever changed. The tension and fear became part of our daily lives. We tried to ignore the small incidents that continued to occur, the creaking doors, the incomprehensible whispers, but we could no longer ignore the truth. We were living in a nightmare. We decided it was time to leave the house. We packed what we could and moved to a new place. On the last night before leaving, I looked at the house one last time. The windows, now dark and opaque, seemed to be watching us, as if they knew we were leaving. A chill ran down my spine. As we drove away, a sense of relief mixed with deep sadness accompanied us. The house, with its secrets and terrors, was finally behind us. But we knew the memories of that experience would never leave us. The images of the dark figures, the whispers, and the feeling of being constantly watched stayed with us, like an indelible mark. Finally, we found a new home, and life began to move on. But in moments of silence, when the night grew heavy, We still heard the echoes of the old house, the sounds of the past that would never completely leave us. And so, the house with its dark past continued to haunt our memories, a constant reminder that sometimes evil is real and hides where you least expect it. And for those who stayed until now, I have prepared another spine-chilling story. Now, enjoy our bonus story. The Curse of Amityville, the frightening account of the Lutz family. I never imagined that a house could have so much power over someone. When my wife Kathy and I bought the house in Amityville, New York, we were excited. It was the perfect home for our family. The house was spacious, with a huge backyard for the kids to play in. With our 3 children, Missy, Daniel, and Christopher, we moved in with the hope of a new beginning. Right from the first day, something felt off. When we walked through the front door, I felt a chill run down my spine, but I ignored it, attributing it to the exhaustion of the move. The house had a strange atmosphere, but I tried not to think much of it. That first night, after putting the kids to bed, Kathy and I were exhausted. We decided to go to bed early. In the silence of the night, I heard a strange noise coming from downstairs, as if someone was walking through the living room. I thought maybe one of the kids had gotten up, so I went down to check. But there was no one there. The following days were full of small incidents that left me uncomfortable. Doors we were sure we had locked appeared open. Objects we placed in one spot were found in another. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves they were just distractions from the move. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Every time I passed through the living room, I felt like I was being watched. One day, while unpacking boxes in the basement, I felt an inexplicable cold. The basement was dark and damp, and there was a room at the back we avoided. It seemed to emanate negative energy. I decided to investigate. When I opened the door to that room, the cold intensified. Inside, the walls were painted dark red, and the feeling of evil was overwhelming. I ran out of there with my heart pounding in my chest. Kathy noticed my unease and tried to comfort me, saying it was just my imagination. But I knew something was wrong with that house. Every night that passed, the noises grew more intense, the shadows more threatening, and that constant feeling of being watched never went away. The house was closing in on us, enveloping us in its dark embrace, and I began to wonder if we would ever be able to escape. After that first week, things started to get even stranger. One morning, while preparing breakfast, Kathy noticed that all the cabinet doors were open. She asked if I had done it, but I denied it. We thought it could have been one of the children, but they were all asleep. We closed the cabinets, trying to forget the incident, but the feeling of discomfort only increased. One night, while we were watching TV, we heard heavy footsteps upstairs. Daniel, our eldest son, was in the living room with us, and Missy and Christopher were in bed. I ran upstairs but found no one. The children were sound asleep. I decided to check the attic, where we rarely went. When I opened the door, I felt a cold wind and a strange smell, like something rotten. I climbed up carefully, but everything seemed normal. Only the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The noises became more frequent. Footsteps in the middle of the night, doors slamming, whispers we couldn't understand. Kathy began waking up with horrible nightmares, always sweating and trembling. She said she saw shadows, dark figures at the foot of our bed, but when we turned on the lights, there was nothing. The children also started to complain, saying they heard voices and laughter during the night. Missy, our youngest daughter, began to talk more and more about her imaginary friend, Jody. According to her, Jody was a pig with bright red eyes that talked to her and kept her company. Initially, we thought it was just a childhood phase, but the way she talked about him was disturbing. Missy said Jody wanted her to stay awake to play, even late at night. The atmosphere in the house was becoming unbearable. Every corner seemed to hide a dark secret. I couldn't relax. I was always on alert, waiting for the next inexplicable event. The house was consuming us, feeding on our fear. And deep down, we knew we weren't welcome there. Nights became a real torment. Kathy started having nightmares every night, waking up sweaty and screaming. In one of these nightmares, she described a horrible man, with empty eyes, standing in the corner of our room, watching her. We tried to convince ourselves it was just stress, but I knew there was something more. The children were afraid to sleep alone. Daniel, who was always brave, started asking to sleep in our room. Christopher said he heard footsteps around his bed and felt someone touching his shoulder during the night. And Missy was increasingly involved with Jody. She told us disturbing stories about him, saying he protected her from the other shadows that tried to hurt her. One day, while I was at work, Kathy called me in a panic. She had found all the children's beds arranged bizarrely, with the sheets stretched and the pillows stacked in a way none of us would ever do. She said she felt a presence in the room, something watching her closely. I rushed home as fast as I could, but when I arrived, I found nothing unusual except Kathy's terrified look. Things continued to worsen. One night, while we were having dinner, all the doors and windows in the house started shaking violently. The noise was deafening. We ran upstairs, trying to protect the children. When the noise finally stopped, we found all the doors and windows open. There was no logical explanation for that. I started losing sleep, staying up late, trying to find some rational explanation. Every shadow, every sound, seemed like a warning. I knew the house was trying to tell us something, but I couldn't understand what. The feeling of being watched was constant, and the fear was starting to dominate us. Every night was a battle to try to sleep without being disturbed by noises and visions. There was a room in the basement that we avoided at all costs. Every time I passed by it, I felt a cold shiver down my spine. I decided I needed to face my fear and see what was causing that feeling. I went down the stairs with a flashlight, feeling the air get heavier with each step. At the back of the basement, I found a small secret room painted red. The sense of evil was overwhelming. The walls seemed to pulsate, and the air was so cold my breath came out as vapor. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see but knew was there. I ran out of there, my heart pounding in my chest, almost tripping on the stairs. When I told Kathy about the room, she turned pale. She said we should never go back there. But something in that house seemed to call to us, as if it wanted to trap us there forever. We decided to lock the basement door and avoid that place at all costs. Even so, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. One night, while we were in the living room, the lights started flickering. The TV turned on by itself, showing static. The children started crying, and I ran to hold them. When the lights returned to normal, we saw a shadowy figure in the hallway, standing and watching us. I blinked, and the figure disappeared, but the fear remained. Kathy began searching for answers in the house's history. We discovered that years before, a family had been murdered there. The eldest son had killed his parents and siblings while they slept. The story was terrifying, and we began to wonder if we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. The evil presence in the house was surrounding us, and I knew we needed to do something before it was too late. The apparitions started to intensify in a way we could no longer ignore. One night, while we were watching TV, we saw a shadow pass through the living room. I got up quickly, but there was nothing there. The house was becoming unbearable. The children were terrified, and we were exhausted. One day, while Kathy was home alone, she heard laughter coming from upstairs. She went up to check and found Missy in her room, talking to herself. When she asked who she was talking to, Missy calmly replied, "With Jody. He said he doesn't want us to leave." Kathy tried to hide her fear, but she knew something was very wrong. I also started having visions. I saw shadows moving through the hallways, figures passing by the windows. One day, while I was in the office, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The feeling of being watched was constant, and I couldn't shake it off. We decided to seek help. We called a local priest, Father Frank, to bless the house. As soon as he entered, the atmosphere became heavy. He began to pray, but was interrupted by a deafening scream that seemed to come from all sides. The priest was pushed by an invisible force and left the house running, saying he could do nothing more for us. The house was consuming us. Every day was a battle to maintain sanity. The children started locking themselves in their rooms, afraid to come out. Kathy and I were on the verge of collapse, not knowing what to do. The evil presence was becoming stronger, and we knew we needed to make a decision before it was too late. Desperate, we decided to try one last resort. We researched purification rituals and found a specialist in paranormal phenomena. His name was John, and he had a reputation for dealing with extreme cases. He agreed to help us and came to our house. When John entered, the house seemed to react violently. The lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the hallways. He started the ritual, lighting candles and spreading herbs around the house. John prayed aloud, trying to expel the evil presence. Suddenly, the doors began to slam, and we heard screams coming from the basement. We ran to the basement, where we found the red room colder and more oppressive than ever. John continued the ritual but was interrupted by an invisible force that threw him against the wall. He got up, bleeding but determined to continue. With much effort, he finished the ritual, and the house fell silent. For a moment, we thought it was over, but we knew the battle was far from over. The evil presence seemed weakened but still there, lurking in the shadows. John told us we should leave the house as soon as possible. But how could we leave everything behind? We were caught between the fear of staying and the terror of the unknown. On the last night, something happened that sealed our fate. I woke up to a deafening noise. It was so loud it felt like the house was collapsing. I ran to the children's room and found Missy talking to Jody, her eyes glowing a bright red. The doors began to slam. The lights flickered frantically. I grabbed the children, and we ran outside, with Kathy right behind. As we left, the house seemed alive, trying to trap us inside. The walls shook, and a high-pitched scream echoed through the hallways. We felt something chasing us, something that didn't want us to leave. We managed to get out, but the terror was far from over. Outside, under the moonlight, we saw the shadowy figure standing in the window, watching us. We got in the car and left as fast as we could. We looked back only once, seeing the house in silence, as if nothing had happened. We knew we would never return. The house in Amityville was marked in our memories as the place where we faced true evil. We never knew what really happened there, but something told us that if we had stayed one more night, we would never have gotten out alive. The next morning, we returned only to grab what we could carry. The feeling of dread was still with us, but we knew we needed to leave forever. We left furniture, clothes, everything we couldn't quickly take. The house in Amityville was left behind, but the memory of the terrifying events never left us. We moved to a distant town, trying to rebuild our lives. The children had trouble sleeping for a long time, and Kathy still woke up in the middle of the night, sweating and trembling. We tried to move on, but the experience marked us deeply. Whenever we heard a strange noise or felt an inexplicable chill, we remembered the house in Amityville. We never told the whole story to our new neighbors. We only said we had lived through something terrible and needed to start over. Even after so many years, the feeling of being watched never completely left us. The house is still there, waiting for its next victim, and us. We never went back. If you like these stories, you can't miss the story of Sarah, a young woman from New York, who lived weeks of terror when she realized that a strange man was constantly following her. Tio discovered the frightening details of this story based on a real stalking account. Watch the video here in the card or look for the video prior to this one on the channel. Stay brave and until the next macabre story.